In 1942, the United States Office of Education printed a 188-page bulletin called Vocational Training for War Production Workers. And inside it were the exact hand skills your grandfather used to feed a family on a single Friday paycheck. By 1971, that bulletin was out of print. The shop classes that taught from it were being quietly cut, and the National Education Association had pivoted to what they called general track studies. Authority told an entire generation that working with their hands was a dead end. Insiders, the men still running family machine shops in places like Akron and Bridgeport, knew the opposite was true. Number 11 on this list is a trade your grandmother practiced at her kitchen table that, done correctly today, still earns a quiet $72,000 a year in cash with no website and no boss. There was a deliberate moment, somewhere between 1958 and 1979, when American children stopped being trained to make things and started being trained to buy things. The shift was not accidental. The Carnegie Corporation funded the studies. The Ford Foundation funded the curriculum overhauls. And the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare wrote the federal guidelines that defined which skills counted as education and which counted as labor. Trade skills got reclassified as labor. Labor got reclassified as something other people did. By the time your parents graduated high school, the smokehouse, the cobbler bench, and the cane chair on the porch were already nostalgia props, not income. Your grandfather knew that a man with a tool roll and a quiet reputation never went hungry, even in 1933. We forgot. Here is what they knew, and here is how each of these skills still works in a 2026 economy that pretends they never existed. Number 1, hand-stitched leather repair. In 1939, a journeyman cobbler in St. Louis charged 40 cents to re-sole a work boot and could process 14 pairs in a 10-hour shift. The trick is not the stitching itself. The trick is the awl angle and the wax thread tension, both of which are taught in roughly 40 minutes and refined over about 90 pairs. A pre-1980 Singer 29-4 patcher machine, the cast iron one with the cylinder arm, still sells used on industrial auction sites for around $600 and outlasts every modern equivalent by a factor of 3. Your grandfather kept one in the corner of the barn next to the kerosene can, and the smell of beeswax and leather oil is the same smell that hangs in his memory. He did not advertise. People knew. The reputation traveled by word of mouth from kitchen table to kitchen table on a Friday paycheck. Then, in 1968, the Footwear Industries of America successfully lobbied for tariff structures that made imported throwaway shoes cheaper than a single resole, and the Department of Labor stopped tracking cobblers as a separate trade by 1982. The Boy Scouts dropped the leatherwork merit badge as a standalone requirement in 1972. That is exactly why nobody recommends it anymore. A good cobbler today charges $65 a pair and has a 6-week wait list that runs through the winter. Leather does not know what year it is. Number 2, knife sharpening on a root. In 1936, a man named Carlo Pisano walked a 40-block route in Cleveland with a foot pedal wheel mounted on a pushcart and earned $3.20 on a slow Tuesday, which was roughly 2 full days of factory wages at the time. The mechanism is honest. A 220 grit water stone, a 1000 grit finishing stone, a leather strop, and a steady 17-degree bevel will return a chef knife to factory sharp in about 4 minutes. Restaurant kitchens, butcher counters, and grooming salons go through dull steel every 2 weeks like clockwork, and a single restaurant route can yield around $400 a week in cash. Your grandmother would not let a dull knife touch a tomato at the kitchen table, and she sharpened her own on the back of a ceramic mixing bowl when no one was looking. The Cutlery and Allied Trades Research Association in Sheffield documented this technique in 1953, and then in 1979, Cuisinart launched the Home Electric Sharpener, and the National Restaurant Association quietly recommended members buy disposable knife sets instead. The trick was reframed as a service that only certified professionals could provide. Banks spent decades convincing you a root business needed an LLC and a payment processor. It does not. A cash box and a clipboard built more wealth in 1955 than a Stripe account does now. The wheel still spins. Number 3. Chimney sweeping and flue inspection. In 1924, the National Board of Fire Underwriters reported that fully 1 in every 28 American house fires originated in an uncleaned chimney, and a working sweep in Pittsburgh charged $2.75 per inspection, performing roughly 6 per day. The work itself is straightforward: a weighted brush, a set of fiberglass rods, a soot vacuum, and a creosote test card. The skill is reading the deposit grade. Level 1 is loose ash. Level 2 is crusty buildup. Level 3 is hardened glaze that requires chemical treatment. And knowing when to refuse a job that needs a mason instead of a sweep. Your grandfather had a black bristled brush hung on a nail in the cellar next to the coal scuttle, and he cleaned the flue every October before the first hard freeze. And the soot smell on his work coat was the smell of a house that would not burn down in February. Then, in 1973, the OPEC oil shock pushed Americans back to wood stoves and pellet inserts. The Consumer Product Safety Commission began regulating chimney products in 1974, and the certification bureaucracy that emerged through the Chimney Safety Institute of America in 1983 added paperwork that scared off independents and rerouted the customer to franchised national operators. That is exactly why nobody recommends it anymore. A solo sweep today clears around $145 per house and books out every fall. Smoke still rises the way it did in 1924. Number 4. Hand-built wooden cane chair seating. In 1948, the Bureau of Labor Statistics listed chair caning as a recognized journeyman trade, with an average billable rate of $1.10 per square inch of woven surface. The mechanism is patient and exact. You strip the old cane with a paring knife, soak the new rattan strands in warm water for 40 minutes until they are pliable, and weave the 6-step pattern: vertical, horizontal, vertical again, then the 3 diagonals, in a sequence that has not changed since the Shaker workshops in New Lebanon, New York, closed in 1947. The forgotten part of the trick is the pegging order at the corners, which determines whether the seat lasts 30 years or 3. Your grandmother did this on the back porch on Sunday afternoons with a glass of iced tea and a paring knife, and the smell of damp rattan in the morning sun is still the smell of money that nobody reported on a tax form. She was not crafting, she was earning. Then, in 1965, Sears began selling pre-woven plastic cane sheeting that could be stapled onto a chair in under 12 minutes. And the home economics curriculum stopped teaching the hand pattern by 1971. The Department of Education declared it an art rather than a trade. A real hand-caned seat today bills out at $420 per chair, and antique restorers in Charleston have a 9-month backlog. The seat outlives the dining room. Number 5. Blacksmith hardware and forged hooks. In 1928, the Anvil's Ring Trade Journal documented that a village smith in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, could forge 22 coat hooks in an 8-hour day and sold them through the local hardware store for 30 cents apiece. The mechanism is forgiving. A coal forge, a 110-pound anvil from any pre-1970 Trenton or Hay-Budden foundry, a cross-peen hammer, and about 3 months of practice will let you hand-forge functional hooks, brackets, fireplace pokers, and gate latches that outperform anything stamped at a Home Depot by a factor of 10 in tensile strength. Your grandfather kept a forge behind the smokehouse for repairs the hardware store could not handle, and the ring of hammer on anvil at 5 in the morning was the sound of a household that did not call for service. Then, in 1958, the American Iron and Steel Institute began aggressively marketing cold-stamped imported hardware to retailers. And by 1972, the trade had been folded into hobbyist category by the Bureau of Census. They quietly redefined a working trade as a leisure activity. The Artist Blacksmiths Association of North America was founded in 1973, specifically because the working blacksmith had been declared extinct by every federal agency that had ever counted one. A custom-forged hook on Etsy today sells for $38, and the same hooks your grandfather hammered out in an evening would today be priced as folk art. The fire is the same fire. Number 6. Hand-loaded ammunition and reloading. In 1957, a hardware store clerk in Casper, Wyoming, named Joyce Hornady, was selling reloading dies out of the back of his shop for $9.95 and pulling in an extra $160 a month doing custom loads for ranchers and varmint hunters. The mechanism is mechanical, not chemical. A single-stage press, a set of carbide dies, a powder scale accurate to 1/10 of a grain, and a reloading manual, and you can produce ammunition at roughly 40% of the retail price, with tighter tolerances than factory loads. The trick is in the seating depth and the crimp consistency, both of which are taught in an afternoon and refined over a winter. Your grandfather had a Lyman press bolted to a corner of the workbench in the basement, and a coffee can full of brass casings sorted by caliber. He did not call it a hobby. He called it Tuesday. Then, in 1968, the Gun Control Act pushed component sales behind federal logbooks, and by 1994, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had pivoted to recommending consumers buy commercial ammunition exclusively with full paper trail and serialized lot numbers. The home reloader was reframed as a regulatory risk rather than a frugal household. A skilled reloader today saves around $800 a year on rifle ammunition alone, and a small reloading practice can produce side income. The press still indexes. Number 7. Hand-soldered copper plumbing repair. In 1953, the Plumbing and Heating Industries Bureau reported that a residential service plumber in Detroit charged $2.15 per joint for a sweat-soldered copper repair and could complete 11 jobs in a single workday with one apprentice. The mechanism is sequential and forgiving if you do not rush. Clean the pipe with a 60 grit emery cloth. Flux both surfaces with a lead-free paste. Slide the fitting on. Heat the joint until the flux smokes a steady blue-green. Then touch the solder to the seam and let capillary action pull it through the entire fitting in under 3 seconds. Your grandfather kept a propane torch and a roll of OD 95-5 solder in a tin box under the kitchen sink next to the wrench roll. And a leaking joint at midnight was a 30-minute repair, not a $400 service call. Then, in 1986, the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act ban on lead solder restructured the supply chain. PEX flexible piping arrived from Europe in the late 1980s, and the plumbing trade unions quietly stopped training apprentices on copper-only systems after 2001. The skill survived only in older tradesmen who learned it before the consolidation. Banks spent decades convincing you that any plumbing repair required a licensed professional and a permit. A licensed copper repair today bills at $175 per joint with a 4-day wait. Water still finds the lowest point. Number 8. Taxidermy and skin mounting. In 1934, a country taxidermist in Branson, Missouri, charged $4.50 for a shoulder-mounted white-tail deer and processed roughly 70 mounts in a single hunting season, almost all of it cash and almost all of it untraceable. The mechanism has barely changed since the Ward's Natural Science Manual of 1907. Skin the animal carefully around the eyes and lips. Salt cure the hide for 14 days. Mount it on a polyurethane form. Set glass eyes from a specialty supplier, and finish with a fine airbrush and a careful pass of taxidermist's clay around the lip line. The trick is in the eyelid set, which is what separates a hunting trophy from something that looks like roadkill. Your grandfather knew which neighbor to call after a successful hunt, and the trade kept rural workshops solvent through 3 recessions when the lumber mill closed. Then, in 1973, the Endangered Species Act tightened legal possession. The National Taxidermists Association formed in 1972 in response, and by 1985, the Internal Revenue Service had reclassified taxidermy income from hobby to Schedule C self-employment, with full payroll obligations and quarterly filing. The American Museum of Natural History stopped taking apprentices in 1979. A modern taxidermist charges around $950 per shoulder mount and works a 1-year backlog. The skin remembers. Number 9. Well witching and hand-dug well construction. In 1941, the United States Geological Survey published Water Supply Paper 257, which dryly noted that experienced rural well diggers located groundwater within 10 feet of the actual aquifer roughly 78% of the time, using a forked willow branch and a slow walk across the property. Authority called this superstition and removed it from the agricultural extension curriculum. Insiders, the men who dug wells in Tennessee and Missouri through the dry decade of the 1930s, knew that what looks like dowsing is partly an unconscious read of vegetation density, soil color, surface drainage patterns, and where deer come at dawn. Your grandmother knew the willow tree near the kitchen window grew that thick because the water table was high under the back 40, and she did not need a license to know it. Then, in 1957, the National Water Well Association began promoting truck-mounted rotary rigs that cost the homeowner around $3,000 per well, and the Cooperative Extension Service stopped teaching hand-dug well technique by 1965. The Department of Agriculture eventually pivoted to recommending municipal water hookups with monthly fees instead. A modern well witcher in Vermont still walks properties and charges around $300 per consultation, and the success rate has not changed since 1941. The water table does not care which century it is. If this video is helping you think about your grandparents' work differently, a quick like helps the channel keep making this kind of content. Completely up to you. Just wanted to mention it. Number 10. Sausage casing and curing for smokehouse meat. In 1932, the United States Department of Agriculture printed Farmer's Bulletin 1186, which laid out a complete pork curing schedule: 2 pounds of salt and 3 ounces of brown sugar per 100 pounds of meat, hung in a hardwood smokehouse for 36 hours at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The mechanism is microbial. Salt pulls moisture out of the muscle fiber. Smoke deposits phenols that inhibit Clostridium and Listeria, and time finishes the work over the course of 3 weeks. The trick that nobody tells you is in the cool-down stage between the smoke and the storage, which is where most modern home attempts fail. Your grandfather had a cinder block smokehouse behind the woodshed, with a hickory fire burning low for 2 full days every November after slaughter, and the smell of curing pork on a frosty morning is permanent in the memory of any child who grew up near it. Then, in 1967, the Wholesome Meat Act extended federal inspection requirements to any meat sold across county lines, and the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service pivoted to recommending that home consumers buy commercially processed, nitrate-cured products with higher margins and shorter shelf life. The home smokehouse was reclassified as a sanitation risk by 1974. That is exactly why nobody recommends it anymore. A small batch cured ham today retails for around $14 a pound. The smoke still preserves the same way it preserved in 1932. Number 11. Hand-rolled cigars and tobacco craft. In 1959, a torcedora working out of her kitchen table in Ybor City, Florida, hand-rolled around 300 cigars in a 6-day week and earned roughly $112 in cash, more than most factory women in the country at the time. Done correctly today, the same trade still yields a quiet $72,000 a year with no website and no boss. The mechanism is touch and patience. A chaveta blade, 3 filler leaves of the correct ligero seco velado ratio, a binder leaf, a wrapper leaf, and a steady damp cloth to keep the tobacco at 65% humidity. The trick is in the bunching of the filler, which determines whether the cigar draws evenly or burns in a tunnel down one side. Your grandmother in some American families did this for grocery money and never told the IRS, and the cigar table in the corner of the kitchen was the family's savings account. Then, in 1972, the Federal Trade Commission tightened tobacco labeling requirements. The Food and Drug Administration eventually pivoted in 2016 to regulating premium cigars under the same framework as cigarettes, with manufacturer registration fees starting at $5,000 per facility. And the cottage trade was effectively criminalized for anyone who could not pay the entry fee. A skilled home-rolled cigar still sells privately for around $12 a piece. The leaf rolls the same way it rolled in 1959. Number 12. Basket weaving with split white oak. In 1937, a basket maker in eastern Kentucky harvested a single 20-foot white oak sapling, rived it into eighths with a froe, and produced 34 egg-gathering baskets that sold through the Pi Beta Phi Settlement School in Gatlinburg for $1.60 each. The mechanism is geological in patience. You select a 6-inch diameter white oak with no branches in the lower trunk, fell it in the spring-rising sap, rive it green into ribbons, soak the splints in cold water for 2 days, and weave them while still pliable around a wooden mold. The trick is in choosing the tree itself, which is a skill that takes a decade to read accurately. The bark pattern, the lean, the soil. Your grandfather knew which tree in the back lot was the basket tree, and he marked it years in advance with a small notch at chest height. Then, in 1962, the Tennessee Valley Authority's expansion projects flooded much of the prime white oak riv country in eastern Tennessee. The Department of the Interior tightened sapling harvest permits on federal land in 1976, and by 1985 the craft had been folded into the Smithsonian Folklife Festival as heritage rather than industry. The Department of Commerce stopped counting basket makers as a labor category by 1990. A hand-woven white oak basket today sells for around $240. The wood splits along the grain it always split along. Number 13. Beekeeping and small batch honey extraction. In 1947, a beekeeper in Door County, Wisconsin, managed 40 hand-built Langstroth hives, harvested an average of 72 pounds of comb honey per hive per season, and earned around $2,800 a year on the side while working a day job at the lumber yard. The mechanism is rhythmic. A smoker, a hive tool, a bee suit, and a centrifugal extractor turn nectar into a shelf-stable product that does not spoil for at least 3,000 years if sealed correctly, which is one of the few foods on Earth with that property. Your grandmother kept 2 hives behind the lilac bushes and traded honey for canned goods at the yard sale every August. And the smell of warm beeswax on a summer afternoon is one of the sense memories that an entire generation lost when the hives moved to industrial pollinators. Then, in 1987, varroa mites arrived in the United States through unregulated bee imports. The Environmental Protection Agency restructured pesticide guidance in ways that favored large operators, and large-scale commercial pollination operations consolidated under firms like 80 honey farms, which now control thousands of hives at once. The hobbyist was quietly squeezed out. Small batch raw honey retails for around $18 a pound. A backyard apiary still produces, and bees still do not read federal registers. Number 14. Leather harness and saddle stitching for tack repair. In 1951, a harness maker in Lexington, Kentucky, charged 65 cents per inch of saddle stitching and could repair the entire bridle rig on a working horse in under 3 hours, billing roughly $9 per repair. The mechanism is dual needle and self-locking. 2 needles, 1 waxed linen thread of 120-pound tensile strength, a pricking iron at 6 stitches per inch, and a saddler's clamp to hold the work, and you produce a seam that does not unravel even if cut at one point. The Marine Corps still teaches a version of this technique for parachute rigging, because no machine stitch matches it for strength per weight. And that is documented in Field Manual 10-450. Your grandfather kept an awl, a stitching pony, and a roll of harness leather in the workshop, because horses, mules, and dogs all needed repaired tack. And the smell of saddle soap on a Saturday morning is the smell of a household that fixed its own things. Then, in 1965, the American Quarter Horse Association reported a sharp consolidation of saddleries into large catalog operations like Schneider's and State Line Tack. And the trade slowly died as imported tack arrived from India and Argentina at 1/5 the price, with 1/10 the lifespan. The trade was outsourced quietly. A custom saddle stitch repair today bills at roughly $11 per inch. The needle still finds the same hole twice. Number 15. Hand-cut barbering and shaving. In 1928, a journeyman barber in Cincinnati earned around 40 cents per haircut, 15 cents per straight razor shave, and served roughly 38 men in a Saturday shift, which translated to roughly $22 in a single day. The mechanism is rhythmic and tactile. A 7/8 inch hollow ground straight razor, a horsehair strop, a hot lather scuttle, a pair of Henkel's shears, and a clipper over comb technique that takes around 18 months to master under a master barber. The trick is in the strop pass, which sets the edge correctly without removing metal, and which nobody learns from a YouTube tutorial. Your grandfather sat in the same barber chair every other Friday after the paycheck cleared, and the smell of bay rum and steam still anchors that memory if you let it sit for a moment. Then, in 1972, the American Medical Association lobbied for state-level cosmetology boards to require 800 to 1,500 classroom hours of licensing. The straight razor shave was reclassified as a medical adjacent procedure in 19 states, and the corner barber shop was steadily replaced by the chain salon with a registered cosmetologist. The reframing turned a 15-cent skill into a $4,000 tuition. A traditional straight razor shave at a remaining old-school shop today costs around $45. Hair still grows about half an inch a month, which is exactly what it grew in 1928. Americans lived for roughly 300 years before the last 60. As a people who could fix their own boots, sharpen their own knives, smoke their own meat, repair their own pipes, and stitch their own harnesses. None of it was heroic. It was Tuesday. Your grandfather and your grandmother did not think of themselves as living an alternative lifestyle. They thought of themselves as living. Then, somewhere between the Carnegie curriculum overhauls of 1958 and the final round of federal vocational consolidations under the Carl D. Perkins Act of 1984, an entire civilization quietly traded the capacity to make things for the convenience of buying things, and the chain broke in a single generation. Forgetting these skills was profitable for someone else. It was profitable for the chains, the brands, the insurance industry that demanded licensed labor, and the federal agencies that grew larger every time a household stopped doing something for itself. You can argue whether the trade was fair. You cannot argue that it happened. Pick one this week. Just one. Maybe it is the resoled boot, the sharpened kitchen knife, the resoldered copper joint under the sink, the backyard hive, or the hand-caned chair your grandmother left in the attic. Tell me in the comments which one you are trying first, and tell me whose hands taught you. Because the trick is not really the skill. The trick is remembering that these hands belonged to your grandfather and your grandmother before they belonged to a curriculum, a license, or a regulator. The Quiet Acre is still there, behind the smokehouse, behind the workbench, waiting for someone to pick up the awl again.